great. So can you please present yourself and explain where you are from and what is your research about and what you are doing?
I'm now a senior research associate in a developmental behavioral genetic laboratory. This is a very interdisciplinary laboratory. Actually, I'm doing something in between of psychology, genetics, and neuroscience. So this interdisciplinarity is something that I'm really get used to. So I'm neither humanities nor scientific kind of a guy, like somewhere in between. Basically, I do research on why do people differ between themselves. So what are the causes of inter-individual differences?
And what was the path which you passed before? How did you get to this topic and what you were working on before?
I think that's funny. I always wanted to be a doctor. Since I was, 3 or 4, I always wanted to be a doctor. I always wanted to be a surgeon. But when I was in 10th grade, I think about that path practical, and I thought that maybe I could manage it. It was a lot of years of education, not a lot of money. There were not a lot of ways where to get money besides university. So I was a little bit on my own. So I decided that I always wanted to help people, and maybe psychology can be a substitute for medicine, for being a surgeon. Then I thought, when I entered the psychology faculty, I thought that maybe I could be interested in helping people. And in psychology at that time, it was like this kind of humanitarian kind of helping, psychotherapy, talking, stuff like that. But after a year of that stuff in university, I thought that maybe I am more interested in more science-based psychology, and that was neuroscience. Like, there was a psychophysiology department in the faculty, and I went there. I spent some time there, going deeper into the brain studies, but at some time I ended in a behavioral genetics laboratory. And what is the funny thing here? One of the main methods in behavioral genetics is basically studying what are the genetical and environmental causes of individual differences. So one of the main methods in behavioral genetics is twin studies. So you compare intra-individual correlations between monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, so identical and non-identical twins. And this is the main methods in behavioral genetics. Where is it funny? And in that, within this method, I'm interested in neuroscience and brain. So what is the differences? What are the causes of brain individual differences? Are they genetic, or are they psychological or environmental? So the funny thing here is that I can really relate to twin study in behavioral genetics because I have a monozygotic twin. I have a twin brother who has studied biology and central neural system biology. And now I'm in between of science and medicine and genetics. And my main methods now is a twin study, and I have a twin, but all that was unoccasional.
Wow. But do you make actual experiments with your brother, or you just basically it inspired you to start, but it was not?
No, I just can relate to my participants, because we always have to have hundreds of twins, and me and my brother are aware of what we're studying of. So we cannot be participants. So that's just a coincidence that I have a twin, and I am doing twin studies right now.
Yeah. Wow. This is indeed the story which I was waiting for, because one of my main points of asking you this was that quite often people, when they start their scientific path or whatever career path, there are some people on their path who influenced them, right? For example, for someone it can be Darwin or Darwin's book. For someone it can be your brother, but were there some professors or some scientists who really influenced your choices, right? In terms of this, who would
there is a guy that I still admire. There was a guy who was a little bit older than me, 3 years older. He's actually gone out of any scientific studies, and he's a machine learning IT guy right now. But my relationship to science was really based on what he was doing. So this exact guy decided to himself that he really doesn't want to be in the academia. But this exact person, his name actually was the same as mine, Ilya. So maybe that was a kind of the thing that make us a little bit closer. He became a closest friend of mine. He really changed my path from any other type of psychology to neuroscience. Ironically, he hasn't been doing neuroscience for more than 10 years right now. He moved away from it right after he finished his PhD.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so but he influenced you with his behavior, right, and his truthfulness.
Mm-hmm. A lot.
Yeah, but actually, for coming back to science, actually, what is your favorite topic besides maybe topics which you work on in neuroscience, which you would love to work on, or maybe which you admire the most? Because this is very huge, right? Neuroscience is very big. Mm-hmm. But what is this topic? I mean, we already talked about behavioral part of it, but are there any other topics or subtopics in this field?
I think that there are 3 things. First, behavioral genetics is really about individual differences. And now maybe the thing I'm most interested in is individual differences. That is still ironic because I have identical twin brother. So this is funny that I'm interested in differences between the people having an identical twin. So this is maybe the first thing. The second thing I'm interested in is the relationship between genetic and environmental causes of individual differences. So people are different, we know that for sure. And the most important part of modern behavioral genetics is to establish what is the relationship between nature and nurture. So we're trying to go away from questions, what is more important, nature or nurture? It's always nature and nurture. There's no or between these things. So nature and nurture relationship is the thing that I am interested second to individual differences per se. And maybe the third thing, I think this is important, being in between of psychology, neuroscience, and genetics, I see this interdisciplinary nature of individual differences. So you always have to think of a complex system that you are studying. And the last thing, maybe the easiest thing and the most popular thing, it is related to the brain studies. It's called connectivity. It's the relationship between different parts of the brain and how the relationship within the brain as the complex systems end up in individual differences.
But do you think it's actually possible to explain such a complex questions between for example, the differences between nature and nurture, which you talk about, for people who are like me, who are not familiar with genetics? Because for me, this was always kind of something, although I work also in computational science, like connected to mathematics, to explain to person these questions for those who don't know anything about genetics. Do you think it's possible?
I don't know whether it is possible, but I think this is one of the things I try to, in every lecture, I'm trying to mention this complex communication between genetics and environment. I think this is one of the main topics I can communicate with public, and I'm not sure that I can show this complexity with my lectures, but I always struggle to do that. And the most important thing for me in science communication, and well, that's what we're talking about, is to show this phenomenon in its complexity, because it's really one of the things that you cannot just steer to the parts and just say about its different parts. It's something that you have to explain in its complexity, and I'm not sure whether I can do that, but I always try to do that.
Yeah, it kind of answers indeed, and also brings connected to this question, because I mean, you already started indeed to talk about science communication, and this is something which I wanted to ask. So for you, what is the main important, if not a rule, but something which is very, very important for science communication? Is it to be able to explain something which is very, very complex, or is it maybe the opposite, that you need to explain basics? Because this is a question for I think for everyone.
Neither. I think neither. In my ideal world, I don't know whether it is possible and whether I am close to this way, but in my ideal world, science communication ends with more complex view of the public. So what you have to do is to show that something is very complicated. I believe that science communication is about making people think about the problems. It's not about explaining things. In the science that I'm into, there are not a lot of things that I can call established. In last 20 years, so many things have changed in behavioral genetics, so that I wouldn't be able to explain all of that to the public. I think that it's much more important to show the complexity of the problem and to make people think. And all the communication should be focused on the making people think about the problem.
Yeah.
The facts, the scientific discoveries, understanding on the topics that are in the science right now, that's not as important as understanding that the problem is complex.
Yeah, I mean, I saw some of your science communication lectures, and actually not only science communication, I saw your scientific also lectures, and I really loved them, because I felt that you were managing to bridge the gap between different communities also, because there were different people in public and you were trying to play with different methods. But which methods you think work best for you when you try to explain something which is very complex? Like, do you have anything for your lectures, for students, for general public? What do you use?
Well, I'm what can be called scientists. I don't know the English word.
Yes, I understand.
I really believe in science, and I really believe in scientific methods. I think that when you can have the right question, when you can make the question in the right way, the science can help you to answer that question. But this is not always the case, and when there's the problem to have the question, then science have to be more modest in discussing that question. So basically, I believe in science. If there's any religion I can relate to, it is science. I don't really think that religious attitude to science is something that can be advocated for. So this is once again, it's very complicated. I think that scientific method is wonderful because this is something that gives you steps. It's not the answer, but it's the ladder that you can use to finally grab the answer. Like, you can always go step by step with scientific methods. But I still have to admit that scientific method is not all that we have, and not all the questions can be answered with scientific methods. So, I think that not only scientific methods are important, but for me, it is one of the best things I can use.
But what, for example, could be one of the example of questions which you were asked, for example, when you were doing lectures in general in science or in science communication? Do you remember anything which you would remember as something as unpredictable question, or were there anything about what you remember now? Like children sometimes ask very, very good questions, which are very deep and which I never thought about. Can you remember anything from your science communication practice?
Yeah, I can remember something about that, but that was not about my science. I was once at a lecture of astrophysicist guy, and there was a 6 years old boy who had the questions about the origin of the universe, the deeper that I could have ever imagined. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case in my lectures. For me, maybe it would be if I ever have a baby, 6 or 7 years old, who has this deepest question, then I would think that I can communicate something important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But unfortunately, I have seen this only at the physicist lectures.
Okay, but actually for me, the lectures in biology, they are much more complex than, for example, many lectures.
Yeah, unfortunately, something I'm trying to say at my science communication lectures is it's not even biology. I'm always somewhere in between. When there's biologists speaking, I'm trying to say that, well, guys, it's not only biology, because there's a thing called reductionism in science, where people try to reduce all the behavior to biological processes. When I hear that, I say, well, it's not only biology. When there's psychologists giving lectures, they are talking about psychological things, environment, and I always say, well, that's not only psychology and environment. There's always biology, and I'm always in between. So I'm always trying to say that, guys, you don't see the whole picture, and you would have the answer only when you will try to see the whole picture. And I'm always somewhere in between.
Yeah, but actually, since you started to talk about interdisciplinarity in science, and since I also know that you are open science and citizen science advocate, I think I really cannot not ask what is now happening in Russia in general in these three pillars in the interdisciplinary science, open science, and citizen science. Could you tell us, like people in general?
Yeah, so I'll try to separate this thing. I'll start with interdisciplinary science.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this is where things is going well. It's not the best, but there is kind of interdisciplinary communication within Russian scientists. It's not the best, but there are communication.
Like where? In for example, in neuroscience or in climatology?
Well, I know about, of course I know about biology, psychology, and neuroscience. I think that the kind of communication between these areas, if we're talking about behavior and its roots, neuroscientific, biological, psychological, sociological, the communication is not very different from the modern world. So people are trying to discuss things. It is the problem everywhere. So people from sociology doesn't want to hear from biologists what do they think about something. But Russia here is not something very different from the world. If we're talking about interdisciplinary stuff.
Yeah.
If we're talking about citizen science, and this is the topic that I adore. Citizen science. I admire people who does citizen science. I have to maybe to explain that citizen science is the kind of the thing where you relate your scientific studies to some real life problems, or you use ordinary people to help you solve your real scientific problems. So it's either you use people as someone who can help you to analyze the data, to put it short, or you use your science to help citizens' problems. This is something I really admire. I would love to have my own citizen science project, but I didn't came up with one by now.
Do you know any platforms actually in Russia which are citizen science platforms, like online platforms?
There is a platform that has just arrived. I don't remember its web address. I will give it to you, Luba.
Mm-hmm.
There is a science communication society that won fund to make this kind of the platform.
Okay.
And this is wonderful. I really admire these people. Unfortunately, in Russia, I think there's a handful of projects that you can call citizen science. Mm-hmm. All those projects are brilliant, but there's a handful of them. This is about citizen science. And this is maybe about the citizen involvement in public life per se. Like, it's not only about science. Yeah. There is a problem of involving citizens into a lot of things, not only science. But if we're talking about open science, at least in the disciplines that I'm close to, it's psychology, neuroscience, and genetics. Things are great. Yeah, I can say great. Because, one thing in open science is trying to reduce the publication bias by promoting the kind of the publication that is called pre-registered studies, where you first establish your idea and the journal has to promote or reject your idea. But if they promote your idea, they accept your results without, even if your idea was wrong. So basically, you can test negative hypotheses within this registered studies kind of publishing approach. And in Russia, the first registered study journal has been
established
it has been published not long after it was published in Europe. So and I can it's a little bit of bragging. We edited the first registered studies journal issue in Russia. Maybe after half a year, it was published in Europe. So in psychology, genetics, and biology, you can try to advocate for open science initiatives, and you can see that something is changing. And I think that the scientific society in Russia can accept these modern scientific ideas. Of course, there are a lot of people who will grab behind, but actually, there are a lot of people in Russia who are interested in modern science and its initiatives. Yeah. And this is the thing that I like about Russian science.
Yeah. So similar to this, I wanted to ask, because before to come back to the science communication I wanted to ask, since you already did some science communication on open science, could you explain to those people who will listen this, who are not familiar with open science, what it is for you, open science?
It is a very broad topic, but I would say that basically it's openness to the results of your study. So you try to make your study open to criticism. And this is about registered studies. So you make your results open to criticism. Then actually open science emerged as a way to make the results of scientific community to be open. So just making the articles to be published open to the society. And this question, the quest is not over, but scientific publishing has become much more open than it was 10 years ago. But now I think it's much more important about the openness of your data and your results. And you have to be really transparent about your data, about your methods of analysis, and about your results, and about your claims that you make out of your study. So all of your claims, data, and hypotheses should be open to the public so that they can see whether your claims are really based on something. And, I think that this is, in my point of view, open science is about this openness to the public. Maybe this is the most important thing about the open science.
But for science communication in general, what is then it is important for science communication without which you would not, for example, manage to do it well? Because, for example, for open science, it's clear and what it is for you, good science communication.
Well, this is really a great question, because the way that science communication is done by now is focusing on the results of scientific community. So now science communication is focused on showing to the public the results of the studies. But I think the process of the gaining of scientific knowledge, the process of the experiments is much more important than the results, and scientific communication have to shift from the results to the process, and that would be something that would change the situation, because I think that science is about the method, is about the process, not about the results, because the results are always changing. And the open science is also open to the discussion of the results and their shortcomings. Yeah, so basically, I'm not sure that I agree with modern scientific communication. I think that the focus on the process should be more than on the results.
But for you, when you would, for example, make a lecture about how to make good science communication to people, would you recommend anything to read or to listen? Maybe there are any favorite books on that, or any podcasts or anything what you could refer to?
There are loads of them. There are loads of stuff that I would recommend.
But what I'm asking is more to learn, not to maybe just to listen, but maybe to learn, to inspire, and to,
My favorite guy in neuroscience, for example, is called Neuroskeptic. This is the guy whose main goal is to criticize published studies. And by doing that, he promotes much more knowledge than those who publish studies. So Neuroskeptic is, I think people would write books about them in future. It's really wonderful. Really, Luba, maybe this is just for you, not for the
for the podcast.
For the podcast, but he was the first guy whose blog was published in Nature. So his blog about scientific fraud has so much impact that it was published in Nature as an article. Neuroskeptic is I don't have words enough to say how much I like him. What else? This is really depends on the discipline. I can say my favorite blogs in neuroscience and psychology, or my favorite books in neuroscience and psychology, but I don't think that there is something that could relate to all the disciplines. So if you're interested, I can name some things in English and in Russian in neuroscience and psychology, but it wouldn't be a list that could relate to everyone.
Yeah, I was asking more because I think that every scientist, for example, learns his own way how to do best science communication lectures for different people. It's different thing. But my last question would be actually, if I would be your public and you would be making, for example, a general science communication lecture, and I would ask you what, as you think, would be the future of neuroscience, where you think, where would be something where people would actually go in the future, like researchers, what they would study, what you would answer?
Yeah, well, I would say that the complexity of the problem would be the most important thing for me. So now biology and neurobiology tries to find easy answers to the complex problems. I don't think that this is a good way. I think that trying to show people that the problems are complex is much better way than trying to find an easy answer. So basically, I think that if you are thinking whether it's genetics or environment, you should always think whether your question is right, whether it can be genetics and environment, and not the vice versa between these two factors. So the complexity is something that I would advocate about, that I would advocate for in science communication. I think that science is about making things hard to think about, complex and difficult. And this is not maybe very, very popular, but this is something that we should explain people to.
Yeah, well, I just kind of very final thing to add on this would be if, for example, you know that someone is going now to Russia and he would be very interested to learn what is the science communication community there, where this person could go. This is more a question from a side of lecturers, right, without borders, because if people travel, whom you could recommend them to visit, or which communities, if you know any, or where to go, for example, to library or...
Well, there's a handful of communities. I can list them. Like there is a Evolution Fund community, there is a Postnauka lectures community, there is a Science Slam lectures community, there is Kurilka Gutenberg community. There is, I think, about a dozen of communities that I can recommend. Actually, they're really intersecting. And I think this is a good thing about Russian science. There's at least a dozen of communities that I can recommend. Well, I think this is something that shows that Russian science communication is not in its deepest point. I think that something is going okay if there's at least a dozen of communities that I can recommend.
Yeah, with this I really can only agree on, and I'm personally really looking forward for after COVID times when I will be happy to visit you and these communities, and hopefully you will visit too here. So yes, thank you so much for your time, and yes, we will stay in touch with you.